Joining us online. My name is Yuki Tatsumi. I'm a co-director of East Asia Program and director of Japan programs here at Stimson. And we have had this wonderful partnership with the Canon Institute for Global Studies that are headquartered in Tokyo. Every time one of their researchers come through, we try to do these events to hear Japanese perspective on various things. But these series of events have been organized under one principle. We will try to avoid strictly bilateral issues, such as bases in Okinawa and U.S.-Japan trade issues. But this is really designed to talk more about the world events and where U.S. and Japan, first of all, each sits, and then where each country can do either together or separately, or working with the third and fourth and fifth and sixth other partners. Just a quick reminder for everyone, for Q&A, I'm sure you have found a little note card on your seat. There is a QR code, so please use your phone to scan that, and then that'll lead you to the Q&A page, and you can punch in your question there, and it'll miraculously show up in the iPad that I have. So if you can do that, that will be wonderful. Because we always do this to accommodate as many questions from the online audience as well. So thank you for your understanding and cooperation. So like I said, we have 3 great speakers, and as we know, there are a lot of things going on in the world today. And this is a particularly interesting time to talk about world's hotspot. And I apologize in a classic Japanese style that we don't have a European expert here to talk about Russia, Ukraine. But I think we'll keep quite busy between Indo-Pacific and Middle East. Immediately to my left, sits Ambassador Dave Scheer. He's currently a senior fellow at the Raisi Center at the Johns Hopkins School of International Studies. Ambassador Scheer has a long and distinguished career as a career diplomat, retired from the Foreign Service after served as the U.S. ambassador to Vietnam. And then he's again called back to the duty to serve another government position, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs. And since then, you can all agree with me that his retirement suits him very well. But he still continued to monitor, and he still actively teaches at SAIS, and thus continue to monitor this institute, the regional developments quite closely. Next to Ambassador Scheer is our own Stimson's own Barbara Slavin, distinguished fellow and a project lead of Stimson's Middle East perspective. And she touched upon North Africa as well, right? A little bit?
A little bit, more Middle East.
So prior to joining Stimson, Barbara founded and directed the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council. She's an author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the U.S., and Twisted Path to Confrontation. And I felt really bad for asking Barbara to come on today because I know she really hasn't got too much sleep. But I promised that this will be in an hour. And then she kindly agreed. So thanks, Barbara, for doing this with us. And last but not least, I have Mr. Kunihiko Miyake, who is a senior advisor at Canon Institute for Global Studies. Previously, he served at the Canon Institute for Global Studies as a research director for their Foreign Policy and National Security division. But even before then, he, like Ambassador Scheer, he has a long and distinguished career as a Japanese Foreign Service officer, serving in multiple places, including United here in Washington, Iraq, and also Beijing. He's an active writer and commentator still, and he, like Ambassador Scheer, continues to teach younger generation at the Ritsumeikan University, where he teaches foreign affairs, and also he runs a student-led crisis simulation based on various foreign policy crises. So the way I would like to do is I would ask each of them an opening question, and then each of them have their own opening remarks. And after that, because we only have an hour, we'll go right into question and answer with all of you and those of us who are joining online. So first of all, let me welcome everyone, and then also by welcoming the guests from the farther apart. Let's say I'll go to Kuni for the questions. So as I just mentioned, lot has going on in the world. And then, as we know, Prime Minister Kishida just finished a very successful summit last month, where the core message of that summit was U.S.-Japan global partnership as opposed to regional. So from where you sit in Tokyo, including the current ongoing crisis, and I'm sorry you arrived in the middle of all this Middle East thing going on, but you are a trained Arabist as well, so looking forward to your perspective at that. But how does Japan see this, and where does this all look from Tokyo?
Well, I don't represent my government, but first of all, thank you, Yuki, and everybody here for coming. And it's been a while since I was here to talk to you, but for the past few years, things have changed a lot. And today, I'm not going to talk about specific country or specific administration or specific anything. I'd like to share with you my take on what's going on in this world. And I may challenge some of those experts, but I don't care. First of all, as far as I'm concerned, there are three important theaters of operation on Earth. One is an European theater, second is a Middle Eastern, and the third is Indo-Pacific. The three theaters have been separated in a sense, different from each other, not related to each other for a long time. We fought the war, or the Americans fought the Cold War in Europe. You didn't need us, Japan. And then after the demise of the Soviet Union, you go to the Middle East, and you didn't start it. They started the war on terror. And you fought for a while. We cooperated with the Americans, but we never fought in the Middle East. And then with the withdrawal from US forces from Afghanistan, people thought, actually it didn't happen, but people thought that the Americans are leaving the Middle East and going to the Indo-Pacific, which is wrong because the US forces are still stationing in the Gulf. But anyway, now the European theater, from European theater to the Middle Eastern theater, and now Americans started focus on the Indo-Pacific theater once again since the 1970s. You fought two wars already in the 50s in Korea and the 70s in Vietnam, but now it's the most serious one. But what I'm trying to challenge you this time is that telling you that those three different theaters of operation are now merging into one. And without that kind of perspective, I don't think we can deter any revisionist powers in those three theaters of operation. So in a nutshell, what I'm saying these days is that we failed to deter Russians in Ukraine. We failed to deter Iranians in Gaza. And next possible failure could be in our part of the world. How can we deter the revisionist powers in those three, or one, merged theaters of operation? We are trying to deter our big neighbor. I don't want to name. There's another small one, but the big one is more important. In order to deter such a big neighbor, for us, I mean the United States and Japan and other like-minded countries, I ask my students, what do we have to do to deter that of huge nation? I ask them, and they say, well, we need a more robust and more powerful U.S.-Japan Security Alliance mechanism. I said, no. What I'm telling them is this. in order for the United States and Japan to deter whatever contingencies in our part of the world, the most important thing we need is a stronger NATO to deter Russians. Number two, we need more stable Middle East to deter the Iranians. Then we can deter whatever aggressions in that part of the world, simply because the Russians are using Iranian drones. And they are using North Korean ammunition, almost, supplied by some neighbors. Okay? So this is the reality. So we cannot focus on one theater of operation anymore. We have to look at them all together from one perspective. Otherwise, we will fail. Because if we fail, continue to fail in Europe and continue to fail in the Middle East, we cannot deter. This is what I have been thinking about for a long, long time. And especially for the past few years, I am convinced that the next problem could be somewhere in East Asia. And how can we do it? See, Mr. Kishida's visit to the United States was very successful, thanks to everybody. But the memory of the diplomatic victory lasts for a week or two. And we have to do more. But what shall we do? In the past, by the way, how much time I have? 3 more minutes.
2 more minutes.
No, in the past, as I said, in Europe, we didn't fight with the Americans. And you won the Cold War. In the Middle East, we cooperated with the Americans. We never fought a war together. But in the case of our part of the world, we should be able to fight together for the first time since maybe the Boxers' Rebellion. I never know. Why? Because our neighbors are so formidable, and we cannot deter by ourselves. And Americans need us because without the U.S. bases in Japan, and especially on Okinawa, you cannot deter them. And by the same token, we cannot deter our neighbors by ourselves. We need to be able to fight together. Well, doesn't mean that we are warmongering or we are aggressive. No, in order for them, to inform them of the reality, strategic reality, we should be able to show that we can fight together. And that's the only way we can deter them. So the nature of Japan-US security alliance is transforming. It's evolving. It's not only for the East Asia and the Indo-Pacific, but it is for the Middle East, the deterrence in Europe as well. So this is how I see the world. And are we ready for that? Probably not. And we should do more, but otherwise we won't be able to have peace in our part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Kuni. Barbara, as Kuni mentioned, now go to the stable, possibly, hopefully stable Middle East if we can ever get there. But obviously, a lot has been going on in your part of the world. And we actually, for the first time, as long as I can remember, we're really feeling that ripple effect in the U.S. too, as we're seeing in all these protests across the U.S. campuses. And now, this past few days, just in the last few days, we have more news coming out of the region. So how do you think all this development affects the dynamism in the region? And what is the best way forward for U.S. or more, like-minded countries, including the U.S.?
Well, first of all, Yuki, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on a panel with you, and I'm very much enjoying working with my colleagues here at Stimson on a number of issues. The Middle East. Well, I was a journalist in the Middle East, and we had a saying, it can always get worse. And this has certainly been true since October the 7th. There was an illusion of stability and a relative absence of violence, but that did not mean that the region was stable. So many unresolved conflicts cannot lead to stability. We have a region that is full of autocratic governments that to some extent reflect the interests of their people, but often not. So you have a lot of simmering discontent in most of these countries. And then you have big issues like the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which had basically been swept under the rug because it suited the Israelis and most of their Arab neighbors to sweep it under the rug. What happened on October 7th obviously blew all of that up into the air. And I would object a little bit to the notion that it's Iran. I mean, Iran supports Hamas, gave it something like $100 million a year, training from Hezbollah. The United States gives Israel $4 billion a year and just approved another $14 billion in aid. So the core of this issue is the fact that there are 7 million Palestinians in the region and millions more outside who do not have an address, a state, a passport, a country. Despite the fact that 3 more countries today recognized the supposed state of Palestine, Spain, Ireland, and Norway, a majority of members of the General Assembly have recognized a country that doesn't exist. I think back to my old days as a Soviet hand and time spent in the Soviet Union. A Palestinian state to me is like the way communists would define the word horizon. A horizon is an imaginary line which, as you get closer to it, gets farther and farther away. And the Palestinian state, certainly for the last 30-odd years, has been this imaginary state. So on paper, there is a Palestine, but in reality, we have a situation where Palestinians are farther from a state than they have been in decades. The Israelis have settled most of the West Bank and I think are on track to annex the West Bank if we have a Trump administration in the United States again. They have occupied Gaza again after having left the territory in 2005. Now they have fully reoccupied it. And I don't think they're going anywhere. I think they're going to stay and continue to try to eliminate Hamas, which is a fool's errand because for every Hamas member they kill, someone else will join or be inspired to become a militant against Israel. So we have efforts. I mean, I give the Biden administration full credit for trying very, very hard to come up with a vision for the region that allows Israel to benefit from recognition from Arab states, including potentially Saudi Arabia, but offers some sort of prospect to the Palestinians of some sort of sovereignty in some kind of territory or entity. It's a valiant project, but I don't think it's going to work. I think the government of Bibi Netanyahu, most right-wing government in Israeli history, is determined to continue to do what it has done. Having reoccupied Gaza, it is going to stay there. This is going to continue to alienate much of the global South. It's going to alienate Americans, young Americans on college campuses. And many others. In the history of the Middle East, this is the bloodiest war that has been fought. It's the longest since the War of Independence, and 35,000 dead in 8 months. It is unprecedented at every level. We had a panel here on Monday on the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which is trying still to somehow provide services to Palestinians. They've lost almost 200 of their workers. They are struggling to prevent those who are still alive from dying of diseases or starvation. And we just had the International Criminal Court announce indictments against Bibi Netanyahu and his defense minister for crimes against humanity and war crimes. I mean, all of this is unprecedented. So, Iran, briefly. In the midst of all of this, a helicopter crashed on Sunday and killed the president of Iran and the foreign minister and some other senior officials. This, frankly, in the scheme of things, was less of an earthquake because the president of Iran is not the head of state. He's more like a prime minister. The president, the head of state is the supreme leader of the country, who is still there, although he is 85. And the chief effect of this is that it unsettles the succession to the supreme leader because the president, Raisi, was considered a leading contender to succeed the supreme leader. So there will be new elections for president. There will be some jockeying in terms of who would follow the supreme leader. I just wrote a piece today for U.S. News and World Report where I argue that Iran, rather than being a menacing part of the axis of authoritarians, as you've painted it, is actually rather fragile now. And that this is a moment when the United States could perhaps, through the channels that we do have with Iran and with neighboring countries, try to de-escalate some of the regional tensions, not just to prevent a wider Middle East war, but also to try to get the Iranian nuclear program, which we haven't talked about, to curb that just a little bit so it doesn't go the way of North Korea and actually develop bombs. The next couple of months in Iran are going to be, the Iranians want stability. They don't want more violence. They don't want anything that could rock the boat. So it may actually be an opportunity, in the next few months before our elections, but maybe I'll stop there. And
Right, Iranian nuclear program, that
Yeah.
deserves an entire hour
Yeah.
again, too.
Yeah.
But last not but least, Dave. So as Kuni mentioned, Indo-Pacific seemed to be the only region for now that the deterrents seem to be holding. But then Barbara just talked about challenges in the Middle East, and she didn't even have to mention the Iran nuclear, which is another one, another huge one that we didn't discuss today. But we obviously need to keep our eye on Russia, Ukraine. So in midst of all this, how do you think U.S. needs to manage all these, frankly, simultaneous crises? Two are hot, one is residual and have a potential to get hot, by working with allies and partners.
We need to walk and chew gum at the same time. Let me start by thanking Yuki for inviting me, and thanks for having me join you today. I'm going to spend about 8 minutes telling you why I agree with Kuni, basically, with some variations. And I want to start with at least what I understand to be the big picture. We talk a lot in Washington about this being an age of great power competition, but I think it's actually much worse than that. We're in an age in which the two great powers straddling the Eurasian continent, China and Russia, along with North Korea and Iran, have aligned against us. And I think this is why all the powers engaged in Eurasian diplomacy have an interest in what happens almost everywhere along the Eurasian periphery, and why Ukraine and the Middle East are so relevant to the Indo-Pacific region. It's because all the most important players are now aligned on one side or the other. If that sounds like 1914, there may be some family resemblances there. The Sino-Russian Entente is not just a marriage of convenience. The Chinese and Russians will tell you that. In the Putin-Xi statement released when Putin visited China, they said this is not a relationship of convenience, and it's not a temporary relationship. This is an entente. It's not a monolithic alliance yet, which is good, and to that extent it works to our advantage, but it represents a real geostrategic danger to the United States. This kind of alignment has happened twice before in the last century. In the 1940s, when the Japanese Empire, and Nazi Germany, and fascist Italy aligned against us, and in the 1950s, when China and Russia, the Soviet Union, aligned against us. The circumstances of the 40s and 50s represented a grave threat to our security because this kind of combination of illiberal powers could dominate the Eurasian fringe, overthrow the liberal order, and command the resources necessary to challenge us in our home hemisphere. The current Eurasian axis represents a similar threat, I think. But there are also big differences. The alignment of the 40s resulted in global war, partly because the United States refused to engage in Eurasian politics in the 30s and early 40s. The alignment between the Soviet Union and China of the 50s did not result in war, I think partly because the United States was engaged so heavily, so deeply, everywhere around the fringe of the Eurasian continent. One difference between those two circumstances and now is that US power has declined relative to the rest of the world, and we need our allies more than ever, not just as platforms for American military forces, but as global military, diplomatic, and economic partners. We need to be able to fight together, as Kuni said. Another difference is that we have never faced a Eurasian challenger as powerful across all domains of statecraft as China. The current Sino-Russian-Iranian combination doesn't just challenge us geopolitically, it presents a longer-term economic and financial challenge as well, and thus a comprehensive threat to the United States and to the liberal international order. One similarity between now and the 40s is the uncertainties associated with the US commitment to participate in Eurasian balance, and we all know how the 1940s turned out. What will it take for us to restore stability around the Eurasian continent? Well, as an old East Asia hand, I always thought that we really should be placing more importance on East Asia and the Pacific, now called the Indo-Pacific region. But I think the current situation actually demonstrates the difficulty of setting absolute priorities, and I think Kuni touched on this as well. 3 administrations have now voiced the need to place more importance on the Indo-Pacific region. That includes the Obama administration in the latter part of the administration. And yet, after all those new national security strategies stressing the importance of the Indo-Pacific, Congress just passed a foreign assistance bill providing Ukraine with $60 billion, Israel with $26 billion, and Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region with only $8 billion. We in the Indo-Pacific think $8 billion is a lot of money, but when you look at it, what we're doing elsewhere in the world, it pales by comparison. I'd bet that the president and our most senior national security officials also spend time on each of these crises that reflects the dollar breakdown of our assistance. I know from experience that when we are faced with crises like Gaza and Ukraine, that's the only thing the president and the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council as a whole can focus on. That's all they can do. When I was in DOD at the end of the Obama administration, all the NSC could think about was Afghanistan. So the current situation, I think, demonstrates that given the difficulty of determining strategic priorities, we need an approach that does more than just preference our region over another. We can continue to manage competition and confrontation all around the Eurasian continent with stronger, more assertive allies like Japan, a defter Eurasian diplomatic strategy, and demonstrated political will. That may be the hardest part. I think this is what the Biden administration is actually doing, and at the risk of sounding partisan, I'm not sure a Trump administration could manage it. With this in mind, what the situation on the Eurasian continent requires, I think, is that first we strengthen deterrence. We need stronger, more confident allies who can aggressively assert interests they have in common with the US, closer coordination with our allies and partners, and closer coordination among our allies and partners themselves, as you see happening in the Indo-Pacific region itself, and between our Indo-Pacific allies and partners and NATO as well. Despite the fact that Macron doesn't want NATO to be engaged in the Indo-Pacific. We need a continued and strengthened American commitment to extended deterrence, and we need to be talking to our allies in Northeast Asia, particularly Japan and the ROK, about what a situation in which a nuclear threat has been leveled against us would look like and what we would do together as allies. We need a renewed and expanded American defense industrial base that can cooperate more closely with allied counterparts, and we're doing that with Japan, Australia, and the UK. That's what AUKUS is all about. Hopefully Japan will do what's necessary to join AUKUS Part 2, Pillar 2, as soon as possible. The US itself needs a defter Eurasian diplomacy. We need to avoid opening a 2 or 3 front war, because I'm not sure we could win a 2 or 3 front war now, especially when if our alliances are not firing on all cylinders. We need a diplomacy capable of driving wedges among Axis partners when possible or when necessary, of modulating our approach on one side of the continent depending on circumstances on the other side of the continent. Some people in Washington complained that last year the Biden administration looked like they were chasing after the Chinese to engage. Under the circumstances in the Middle East and Ukraine, I'd be doing the same thing if I were president. The last thing we need now, given the situation on the western side of the Eurasian continent, is trouble in the Taiwan Strait. Fortunately, the situation in China has prompted President Xi to sort of go easy, and that too is to our advantage, I think. Finally, the U.S. and allied effort to cultivate we need a U.S. and allied effort to cultivate important middle powers in India, Indonesia, Brazil, and South Africa. Richard Fontaine has written about this in the latest edition of Foreign Affairs. And we need a parallel effort to influence important players in the global South. We also need international economic policies that support our geopolitical goals. And I don't think we're pursuing such policies now and haven't been since the Trump administration. Finally, we need to generate the political will necessary to sustain this effort. The next election will determine to some extent whether or not we can do that. And you now know which way I hope it goes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for this thought-provoking, and I think there are a lot to discuss. We already have a few questions trickling in, so I would just go right into it. So first question, probably this is for more like an everybody question, whoever wants to take it on. What regional investments should the U.S., and I guess in some context Japan as well, prioritize making in the Indo-Pacific and Middle East in order to counter foreign malign influence and deter its adversaries?
What's the first part of the question?
Regional investment.
Investment.
Should we all thinking about prioritizing? Any takers?
I mean,
After you, my dear Alphonse.
Thank you. We're already pouring so much money into Israel, and there is, we have defense relationships now, with most of the major Arab states. Central Command now includes Israel in all of this. We saw that efforts that have been ongoing for years to get these countries to share information in terms of missile defense actually paid off in April when the Iranians decided to retaliate for the assassination of 7 of their generals in Damascus by sending a barrage of missiles and drones to Israel, and basically all of them were shot down. Most of them were shot down with help, particularly from Jordan, UK, France, but also to some extent apparently from the Saudis provided some information, and the Iraqis also. So, that kind of work has been ongoing forever and ever, and it's CENTCOM, GCC based, now with Israel as well. But, I think that beyond these kinds of investments, we have to understand that all of these countries, particularly the Arab states, are hedging their bets. They all have very strong relationships with China now, which is the major economic player in the region. And I frankly have been disappointed that China hasn't stepped up more to help do things like safeguard freedom of navigation. We've seen the Houthis, with help from Iran, menace shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb going into the Suez Canal. And the Chinese have not been formally part of a US-led operation. Even the Arab states, apart from Bahrain, have not been formally part of what is known as Operation Prosperity Guardian to safeguard navigation. This is a basic right, and it serves everyone's interests, obviously, to have freedom of navigation. I feel like the dove between two hawks here. I think that we need to use our diplomatic tools as much as our military tools and our weapons packages and whatnot to use our soft power to try to look for cracks between some of these countries. Iran is not a natural ally of either Russia or China, particularly Russia. And there is a lot of discontent in that country with the foreign policy as well as the domestic policy of the regime, and we should acknowledge that and not just assume that this is World War II all over again. I don't see it in those terms. I think these are very, very different countries. China, of course, despite all of the tariffs that are being dumped on it, still has a very important economic relationship with the United States that I think it is loath to jeopardize, which is our main lever, I think, against a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And so I think we should try to maintain that economic relationship to the extent that we can. And similarly with Iran, I think there are some possibilities there that we need to explore. We shouldn't just say, oh, it's too late. Remember, the reason Iran is looking toward China and Russia is because the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal. The Trump administration quit this in 2018 and reimposed draconian economic sanctions, thereby leaving the Iranians with no place else to go. But China, which has the capacity to circumvent sanctions, and especially Russia, after Russia became a pariah state following the invasion of Ukraine.
Well,
Additionals?
as Dave said, maybe you might have done the same thing as the Trump and Biden administration has done for the Middle East. Probably so, but America, number one, I like to say, America is not a superpower anymore. We have to face it. It's not the superpower of the 1990s anymore. And you cannot fight 2 or 3 major wars and win anymore. And it seems to me that Americans started whack-a-mole game. You got 3 or 4 whacks and whack-a-mole every time, but you cannot do it both, all of them at the same time. It's one at a time. Americans can only address the issue one at a time. This is the reality. So what investment should be done? It is a matter of priority and it's a matter of strategy. What kind of strategy Americans have for the global situation? There are 3 theaters of operation, as I said, and they are merging into one, but still you need a strategy to prioritize the crisis and prioritize the sub-theaters of operation. And do we have answers to that question?
Dave, do you have anything to add, or should I? Do you have anything?
I'm good, thanks.
Okay. So I have a very Middle East specific one for you, Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
World opinion is trending kind of badly toward Prime Minister Netanyahu, while the region region and public, innocent people continue to suffer. So how does Israel emerge from this current devastation campaign of Gaza Strip? What is the likely future of the Abraham Accords for stability in the Middle East? And what is the outlook for finally achieving a Palestinian state, which would have far-reaching implications and impact if it ever comes to that?
Well, as I say, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I don't see a change in Israeli strategy. I think that the Netanyahu government is determined to stay in Gaza. They were humiliated as well as traumatized by what happened on October 7th, and they have gone back in. They're going to stay there. They've built a major corridor across Gaza to make it easier to split it up into pieces. And the Biden administration, Joe Biden, withheld a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, and they sort of brushed it off. They have plenty of bombs and plenty of other ammunition, and they are going to continue to pursue. It is not just, Bibi Netanyahu ideologically believes this is necessary, and his coalition partners do, but the longer the war goes on, the longer he stays in power, the longer Israel avoids new elections, which could cast him aside and make him vulnerable to criminal charges that he's facing in various Israeli courts. And I think also yesterday he saw Robert O'Brien, who was Trump's last national security advisor, might be Secretary of State if Trump returns to power. And I think it's very clear that Bibi wants to hang on until our November elections and see if Trump wins, then he can assume that he will have a much even more sympathetic ear in Washington than he already has with Joe Biden. So I just don't see an end to this. And I worry very much because I think it's not just isolating Israel, but it is isolating the United States as Israel's chief partner for all these many years. And, we can rail against the International Criminal Court and so on. But for much of the world, they see a United States that cares when Ukrainians die, but doesn't do very much when thousands more Palestinians die. It's just the way people see the situation. And, it's hard to produce a good counter-argument here. You can say, yes, Hamas, started this on October 7th, but the Israeli reaction has been so extreme that in much of the world, people have forgotten October 7th, and all they can think about is everything that's happened since.
Thank you. Kuni and Dave, I have an Indo-Pac specific question for you. In a regional contingency in East Asia, for example, involving Taiwan, can the U.S. now rely on Japan to participate and to be networked with the U.S. operationally in response? Or is there no attack on Japan? Will Japan debate whether it can participate? As Biden-Kishida summit shows, I think U.S. expectation of the role that to be played by Japan is running high. Do you think those expectations are realistic?
First of all, it all depends on how the mainland attacks the smaller island. Our territory, called Yonagunijima Island, is only 107 kilometers away from the coast of Taiwan. And when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, the mainland has established 6 live ammunition exercise zones surrounding the island. That means when they react to whatever contingency Taiwan, they will surround the island. That means Japanese territory will be part of the war zone. So if that's going to happen, and it is probably going to happen, then it's not an issue of collective self-defense. It is an individual self-defense, right to individual self-defense, because we are attacked. And also, if I were a smart commander of the mainland, the first target I would attack would be the U.S. forces in Okinawa and Yokosuka and maybe Sasebo. Never know. Because without the U.S. intervention, military intervention in that contingency, the things could be much, much easier. So they will not shoot missiles against the territories, but they use probably cyber or space attacks, which is also constitutes an armed attack. So in that case, we will exercise the right to not collective, but individual self-defense. And that's the probably way we might be able to fight together. But if I were a smarter commander of the mainland, I would avoid that. And that's the nation of Sun Tzu, strategy of Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu's strategy is simple. Win a war without fighting it. And if I were the smartest commander of the mainland, I would apply the Sun Tzu strategy to my operation.
Dave?
With regard to Taiwan Strait contingency, first of all, I think in the short to medium term, a crisis on the Korean Peninsula is probably more likely. The North Koreans have a history of mounting provocations in an election year, and they've been testing a lot of missiles lately, combined with Kim Jong-un's comments at the end of last year that South Korea is now North Korea's mortal enemy, and he's dropping the requirement for reunification. So I think the atmospheric on the Korean Peninsula bodes ill. And I think the likelihood that I would be watching, if I were Assistant Secretary, I'd be watching very carefully for a renewal of North Korean provocations across the DMZ. Not just missile tests, but provocations across the DMZ on the order of the Cheonan sinking of 2010. And a crisis like that will test not only U.S.-South Korea coordination abilities, but it will test U.S.-Japan-Korea ROK coordination abilities since we started cooperating more closely under President Yoon Suk-yeol. So I think a North Korean crisis is probably more likely in the short to medium term than a Taiwan Strait crisis, particularly given Xi Jinping's sort of pullback from wolf warrior style assertiveness in the past year. With regard to our expectations of Japan in the event of war in the Taiwan Strait, I agree with Kuni generally, but I think the U.S. and Japan have a lot of spade work to do before we can fully rely on each other to fight together in the event of a Taiwan Strait crisis. And a good start, we made a good start with Prime Minister Kishida's visit last month, in connection with which we agreed to review command structures in connection with Japan's establishment of a joint headquarters. We have to know what a joint bilateral command structure is going to look like in the event of U.S.-Japan structure is going to look like in the event of a war, and we have to have a better picture of the circumstances under which the Japanese would join the war and or support our forces in a war, and we need a better picture, as I suggested earlier, of what the extended deterrence picture really looks like. And all of that is a lot of work, and in doing it, we will get a much better picture of where each side stands in the event of a crisis and a war in the Taiwan Strait. And at the risk of sounding controversial, if I could revise the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, I think the single most important thing for us to do would be to replace the current, is it Article 5, which states will consult in the event of a crisis, with a NATO-style Article 5 in which we state to each other that an attack on one is an attack on the other. That is probably the strongest deterrent message we could send. I know it's hard. I know it may be unlikely, but I think that's something we should be working toward, if silently.
Well, Dave, I don't think you will make another assistant secretary for
I know, I know.
the foreseeable future. But having said that, 2 fingers short. I agree with him on the probability of the lack of probability of the contingency in Taiwan. But I've been advocating the biggest lesson we learned from the war in Ukraine is very simple. Dictators make mistakes. And absolute dictators make more mistakes because they have less accurate information. So then I tell my audience in Tokyo that, okay, even such a smart dictator like Putin made such a huge strategic mistake. And don't we have similar dictators? One is big and one is small in our neighborhood. Any one of them made a strategic mistake, they will go to war.
That's a profound statement. So I think I kind of vacillated between two of these with the last question, but this is more of a flip side of the coin question. So what will be the reason why Russia, Iran, and China haven't invoked their military actions together against something, which we may all be able to deduct a certain lesson about how we can, what will be the most efficient tactic against, why do you think that has happened? Because kind of thinking through that reasoning perhaps help us understand better about how to effectively counter that.
You're looking at me again. All right,
Okay.
shall I go first and get over it? You know, the U.S. is not this world sole superpower anymore. It's not so much a multipolar world, but I think it's a non-polar world, and I'm stealing this from an economist correspondent who used that term first. There is no one pole. And so all these analogies, axes, you know, if we look, for example, at China, Iran, China is much more interested in a good relationship with Saudi Arabia than it is in a good relationship with Iran. It has much more economic links to Saudi Arabia. There isn't the problem of sanctions. There are a lot of things that they can invest in each other's countries in. And China will do nothing with Iran that would jeopardize the relationship with Saudi Arabia. So there are real limits. This is not, you know, what was it, lips and teeth between China and North Korea? This is not that kind of situation. There are definite constraints. If you look at Iran, Russia, yeah, Iran is providing drones to Russia to use in Ukraine, but their partnership really dates to the Syria civil war, when they got together to save the Assad regime. And this is not a natural alliance. The Iranians, I assure you, still remember when Tsarist Russia ate up big pieces of the Persian Empire 100, 200 years ago. They don't like each other, and their economies are not compatible. They're both oil exporters, gas exporters. So apart from the military, there really isn't much that they can do for each other. Why did Iran look in this direction? Because it's under Western sanctions, primarily US sanctions. We need to rethink our sanctions policy. It's failed. It has mostly impoverished ordinary Iranians while pushing the Iranian state into the hands of the Russians and the Chinese. So we need to be a little thoughtful and creative about this, especially if we don't want Iran to go the way of North Korea and develop nuclear weapons. We have some tools. Will we use them? We haven't so far. There were some efforts made early in Biden term. If he gets a second term, he could certainly take another crack at it. And even Donald Trump, I was at a meeting recently where someone said, well, if you call it the Trump plan of action instead of the joint plan of action, that was the old Iran nuclear deal, Trump might go for it. So we shouldn't write the Iranians off just because right now they seem to be in bed with the Russians and the Chinese.
Thanks. Do either of you-
Well, I agree. They are basically the marriage of convenience. Well, maybe tighter one, but they are not allies, and it won't be. They don't share strategic values and strategic goals. But having said that, Having said that, I think we are facing a dilemma now. As Bob said, if we get too soft on one of those countries, then it could be considered, it could be recorded as a policy of appeasement. And if we're too tough on them, then probably that's too confrontational. It could be another disastrous result. So, but we tend to believe that appeasement works.
I don't think it's appeasement. It's creativity.
Well,
It's diplomacy.
well,
It's not why. You know, again, we're using these old terms from World War II.
it's a historical analysis will conclude that failed appeasement will be disastrous. So we should be very careful. I'm not saying that everything is appeasement, but people tend to be appeasing more than confronting because they don't want to fight. See, they don't want to die. But appeasement is looks like an easy solution, but actually it will be the most costly solution in the end.
Well,
Last word.
I think we're fortunate that the Russians and the Chinese have not established an alliance, and I think we need to do what we can diplomatically to create the conditions that don't encourage them to get closer or to form an alliance. They have an entente now, a strategic partnership in modern parlance, but I don't think they're ready to coordinate on provocations, crises, or wars across the Eurasian continent. They're just not ready to do that. I think the Sino-Russian joint statement suggests that. The Chinese don't come out and say they support Russian actions in Ukraine. The Russians say they support the Chinese approach to Ukraine. The Chinese have dropped the unlimited partnership language. And we're looking at very much a sort of a reversed big brother, little brother relationship now, reversed in terms of the Sino-Soviet alliance of the 1950s. So I think we need a diplomacy in which we can recognize those differences and exploit them.
So on that note, Dave, one final thought from you. When we talk about U.S. engaging other parts of the world, other than the area that region we talked about before, like Pacific Island, Africa, we often hear a lot from the U.S. talks about having a big game about the partner of choice. But those countries and many countries in those regions are basically up and against almost inconceivable influx of money in attempt to influence from what Kuni mentions as the big partner.
Big neighbor.
So big neighbor. So what do you think of that as a final thought?
I look mainly at Southeast Asia, given my experience in Malaysia and Vietnam. And I think Southeast Asia is extremely important. I think the Chinese want to extend a hegemony over the region, particularly continental Southeast Asia, or they would whether they want to or not, if given a chance. And the U.S. doesn't pay enough attention to Southeast Asia. We have very few military forces in Southeast Asia. We've given up free trade areas, which is a main incentive for stronger economic ties between us and the Southeast Asians. My job as ambassador to Vietnam when I went there in 2011 was to get the Vietnamese on board the TPP talks. I helped get them on board with USTR, and I went back after 2017, and the Vietnamese told me we'd pulled the rug out from under them. We don't pay enough attention to Southeast Asia. Fortunately, there's Japan. Japan has extremely long-lived and deep ties with Southeast Asia. In many cases, they provide more economic and development assistance to Southeast Asian countries than the Chinese do. If the Chinese are moving into anybody's sphere of influence in Southeast Asia, it's a Japanese sphere of influence, I think. And Southeast Asia is a good example of how the United States and Japan can cooperate in helping to prevent China from establishing hegemony in that sub-region.
Great. So with that thought, there are so many other questions that I haven't even got to, so I apologize in advance for those of you who put in a question, but I didn't pick up. We only had 60 minutes, and we have to be mindful of everybody's time as well. But with that, thank you so much to all of you for your thoughtful comments and thought-provoking comments, and I think we all learned a lot from it. And thank you, everyone, for attending in person, and then also those of you who take your time and joining online. So with that, let me conclude this event by thanking all the speakers. If you join me in applause. Thank you.